The last texts of terror, I love that title that Shane gave it, is from, if you read Headlines and Happenings, you saw it's from the Gospel of Mark, and it actually has to do with the life and death of Jesus. So, because if you look at the narrative of Jesus, and the authors clearly knew this, there's quite a bit of disturbing elements in the story. It's a very paradoxical story, actually. And so what we'll be looking at this morning are highlights of the way Jesus is represented in, why is Dell peripheral? Wait a minute, I have to get rid of this, sorry. The way Jesus is portrayed in the gospel, in light of previous figures we've looked at, especially the figure of Saul. And so having in mind what happened with Saul last week will help us a great deal understand what's going on in the Gospel of Mark. The first thing to be said is this idea that Jesus is the Son of God. Now, this is so familiar to us. It's like, well, yeah, and our immediate assumption usually is the Trinity, right? So he's the Son, he's the second person of the Trinity. Biblically speaking, and in terms of Israelite thinking, if you will, the Son of God is actually a royal term. And it goes back to, actually, it's not unique to Israel. That's one reason God's probably unhappy with the Israelites when they ask for a king, because the nations around them view their kings as adopted children of God. Even the Romans had this view, actually, adopted sons of God. But when David becomes king, David succeeds where Saul failed, right? So Saul is always the antitype of David. And we'll see that in a particular quote. When David succeeds as the next king, God promises to establish a very different kind of relationship with him and with his descendants. And it happens when David decides, after he's brought Israel to peace by defeating the Philistines, he decides that God really doesn't deserve to live in a tent anymore, or a tabernacle anymore. David has built a house of cedar, and God's still living in a tent. And so he says, I will build God a house for God's name. And God says, no, you won't. It's really interesting. And one of the arguments in the Bible is, why was God unhappy with David building the temple? In Chronicles, it says because he's a man of blood, which is really interesting. So Solomon can build the temple, David is told, his son will build the temple. And we're told in Chronicles, I think that actually is the legitimate reason, that the reason David can't build it is because he was a warrior and he had a lot of blood on his hands. And Solomon's name, Shalom, which is he's a king of peace. When you sing those things about the king of peace at Christmas, we're singing about Solomon. At least the original king of peace was Solomon. But so God is very pleased with David for wanting to build a temple, but makes a promise to him about his descendants that really is important in terms of understanding the Gospel of Mark. So it's in 2 Samuel 7. God says through Nathan to David, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So you notice also that the Davidic kings are intimately tied up with the temple. This is really important to keep in mind. So the Davidic king and the temple go hand in hand. And the king, not the priest, has authority, ultimate authority over the temple. So the priests work for the king, if you will. So he shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me. Right? So that's that royal view, and that's not unique to Israel, but that is coming in with David, that God will be a father to his son, beginning with Solomon, and Solomon shall be a son to me. Notice this, when he commits iniquity, I will punish him with a rod such as mortals use, with blows inflicted by human beings. But this is the key, but I will not take my steadfast love from him. Even if he sins, I will not take my steadfast love from him, as I took it from Saul. Isn't that amazing? I took my steadfast love away from Saul. Like somebody whom I put away from before you, right? So the Son of God, David's son, who we'll call God Father, has a promise that God's steadfast love will never be taken away from him, right? Never be taken away, as it was from Saul. So you're always reminded in the stories of David and his descendants of Saul. Saul is the one you don't want to be, right? Because God took God's steadfast love away from him. In Psalm 89, this is reinforced even more. Psalm 89 is an amazing psalm. It's just a huge riff on 2 Samuel 7. And part of it, God tells David, he shall cry, he being David's son, he shall cry to me, you are my father, my God and the rock of my salvation. And then God says, I will make him the firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth. Forever I will keep my steadfast love for him. And my covenant with him shall stand firm. I will establish his line forever and his throne as long as the heavens endure. So the Son of God, the one who's called the Son of God, is the Son of David and has this promise that the steadfast love of God will never be taken away. And actually, the other promise is he'll never be defeated by his enemies, because you know God doesn't love you anymore, or at least for a while. Maybe not permanently, but at the time, you know when your enemies have power over you that God is turned against you. Right, you know that. It's just like A to B. It's just an immediate inference. So if God never takes God's steadfast love from the Son of David, then enemies can never defeat the Son of David, who was also the Son of God. So this father-son language originally comes from kingship, and it comes from the Davidic kingship. And so when we see in the Gospel of Mark, and turning to our readings, I mean, the Gospel of Mark, even beginning, they didn't put the very first verse in. But the very first verse of Mark is the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So he just cuts right to the chase, right? So in Matthew's favorite term for Jesus is the Son of David, which is obviously virtually a synonym. Mark's favorite term is the Son of God. And so not surprisingly, in his emergence in the public ministry, and of course there's no birth narrative in Mark's gospel, you start right out the gate with John the Baptist, or John the Baptizer, as it's better translated. Jesus comes out from Galilee and is baptized by John in the Jordan. And just as he was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens torn apart and the Spirit descending like a dove on him. And notice that Spirit descending, we've seen that before, that the Spirit of God actually descended on Saul after he was anointed as king. The Spirit of God descended on Jephthah when he became the chieftain, and right after that he vowed to sacrifice whatever comes out of his house if he wins the battle. So the Spirit, so you get this anointing and Spirit coming. It's that's a very old pattern of rule in Israel. So the heavens open, the Spirit descends like a dove on him, and a voice came from heaven, you are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased. So we're told right away what God thinks about Jesus, right? He is the Son. He's also the beloved. I didn't know this when I was younger, but there are two names Solomon receives in the Bible. Solomon is the second son of David and Bathsheba, which is amazing, actually, when you think about it. So Solomon's mother is Bathsheba, with whom David had an adulterous relationship. The first son dies as punishment for David and Bathsheba's sin. But the second son is Solomon, and God names him Jedediah, which means beloved of the Lord, right? And then Solomon is the other name he receives, which means he's a man of peace, right? Shalom and Sholom. So it's really interesting. You are the son, the beloved, are the two different names. This is at least a Zachman inference, but I think it's very interesting. Two different names that Solomon had. He's the Son of God, right? We saw that in those texts, but he's also the beloved of the Lord. And so Solomon looms very large in the way Jesus' life is being portrayed. And he obviously says someone even greater than Solomon is here. Why am I getting these updates? Sorry, this is a very active Zoom today. Okay. So we see further evidence of this later on. We're not looking at every episode, but just the things that are pointing this out in the Mount of Transfiguration, right? When Jesus appears on the mountain with his 3 disciples, and then Elijah and Moses appear with him. And the disciples, of course, don't know what to do. I wouldn't either. I don't blame them. And then a cloud overshadows them. And from the cloud there came a voice, and the cloud is one of the symbols of God's presence, because God dwells in darkness, right? So the cloud overshadows them, so that's a symbol of the presence of God. And from the cloud there came a voice, "This is my son, the beloved." So we get exactly the same title, "Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. So Mark is going out of his way right in the middle of this narrative to show that the title that Jesus receives at the beginning of his ministry is still the title he's receiving now, that he is the Son, the Beloved. And they have no reason to think he's not, right? There's no one he has power over illness, he has power over death, he has power over water, which the only one who has power over water in Israel's mind is God. So he does seem to be very beloved of God, right? He does seem to be the Son of God. But the Son of God, again, not in what you could say is an ontological way, not as divine by nature, that's how we've come to view it, but as the one who's particularly beloved by God, from whom God will never take God's steadfast love, over whom enemies will never have any power, and who clearly then would be the one who would either establish the temple, rebuild the temple, or purify the temple in his own day, but would never destroy the temple, right? Would never do that. So the kingship and the temple, again, go hand in hand. Jumping now to the entrance into Jerusalem, there's this very interesting scene that happens. I always wondered what it meant. When Jesus enters Jerusalem, and he enters from the Mount of Olives, which is exactly where the future king was supposed to come from to enter Jerusalem. So it's not an accident that he enters on this highway, if you will, that goes into the eastern gate of Jerusalem, which has now been completely sealed over, by the way, so the Messiah can never come back. The Jews and Muslims have buried their dead all around that gate, and they've sealed it up. So if the Messiah comes, he'll either be offended by the Muslims or be offended by the Jews. It's really interesting. So there's this whole controversy about that. But Jesus enters in that way, which you can't enter into now. And as he's proceeding in, he's riding on the colt, as you know. Then they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks on it. Right? It's a very interesting symbolic action. And he sat on it. And then many people spread their cloaks on the road. Can you imagine? Like if somebody, a royal ruler, was processing down the streets of Lancaster and you took your jacket off and put it down on the road so you could process on it. They put their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches that they had cut in the fields. Well, there's this very interesting scene in 2 Kings when Jehu is made king. And after he's made king, the prophets, Jehu says, so he said, "This is just what the Lord said to me. Thus says the Lord, I anoint you king over Israel." So this is much earlier in Israel's existence. But then hurriedly, they took all their cloaks and spread them for him on the bare steps. So this is clearly what you do when a king is being proclaimed in your midst. One of the things Israel did was they spread their cloaks on the ground in front of him so he could walk on them. I guess it's a sign of obedience and devotion to the future king. And they blew the trumpet and proclaimed Jehu as king, right? So there's a similar proclamation going on here, that when Jesus is entering Jerusalem, people are behaving as though he's the coming king, right? They put their cloaks on the ground. And then those who went ahead and those who followed were shouting, "Hosanna," which means Lord save. "Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessing is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. Hosanna in the highest heaven." So clearly, Jesus is being portrayed as the Son of God, as the Son of David, as the king who is going to enter into Jerusalem. And of course, where would the first place be that the future king would go when he enters Jerusalem? The temple, right? Because that's where he has his authority. So he enters Jerusalem, went into the temple, and when he had looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. So he's checking out the temple, but he's going to come back, right? And so sure enough, later in that very same chapter, then they came to Jerusalem, so they come back from Bethany. We don't know where Bethany is, by the way. It's kind of interesting. It was very important in the life of Jesus, but we don't know where it is. So it's obviously near Jerusalem. And they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. and he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers. So he's clearly establishing his authority over the temple, right? And clearly in criticism of what the priests and high priests are doing in the temple. It's a shame, actually. He's portraying the people who are money changers and selling pigeons as really bad people. But when you went to the temple, you were usually a pilgrim and you couldn't bring live animals with you all the way to Jerusalem. And so what he did was he brought money to the temple, and outside of the temple precincts, you had money changers who would change the money, which was Gentile, to shekels, temple money, with which you then bought animals to sacrifice in the temple. So I'm like, why was he so upset by that? I'm not quite sure what was going on there, but he clearly doesn't like the way the temple's being run, and he's clearly establishing his authority over it. My own thought about all of this is why he was killed. See, because he's claiming authority over the temple, which means he's claiming royal authority, which means he's claiming kingship, right? And so obviously the chief priests are not going to settle for this. And the Romans certainly wouldn't be happy with that. Also, in Mark's gospel makes it very clear. And when the chief priests and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him. Well, yeah, of course they did, right? But the threat, we always talk about how Jesus threatened the established powers and they didn't know what to do with them and things like that. Well, he did threaten established powers, but in the temple, right? He threatened them in the temple. And that's like the nerve blood of Israel, right? That's the central locus of Israelite life. And even though Israel is now in this period in the diaspora, all through the Mediterranean and all through parts of the world, still the temple in Jerusalem was the center of their worship and of their life. So it's not surprising the chief priests would be very upset by this behavior. And we also get clues as to Jesus' attitude about the temple. Remember, Solomon builds the temple. And then when the disciples are taught, and then Herod rebuilds the temple. So the temple Jesus sees is rebuilt by Herod. The Romans considered it to be one of the greatest wonders of their whole empire. In fact, probably the most glorious temple in their empire. So they were very proud of the temple in Jerusalem. But when Jesus comes out of the temple, this is in chapter 13 of Mark, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." And if you've ever seen the stones, just the Temple Mount, let alone the temple itself, they're huge. I have no idea how they built the Temple Mount, let alone the temple. They said, "Look what large stones and what large buildings." Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." That's very puzzling, right? If you're the Son of God, who's the Son of David, who's the head of the temple, who's going to purify the temple, and it looks like that's what he's going to do in chapter 11, why is he predicting that the temple will be destroyed? And why is his movement always associated with that? Right? In the Gospel of John, in the Gospel of Mark, the false witnesses say, he said, "Tear this temple down, and in 3 days I will build one not made by human hands." Right? In the Gospel of John, Jesus says that in chapter 2 of the Gospel of John. And in the book of Acts, that same quote is said, "These are the people who are against the law of Moses and against our temple." This is when Stephen's about to die. And they talk about tearing the temple down, right? And then Stephen says the temple is made by human hands. That means it's an idol. Anything made by human hands is an idol, right? It's idolatry. So the Jesus movement clearly thinks that the temple in Jerusalem is an idol. It's made by human hands and it should be destroyed, right? In which case, how can this be the Son of God? Right? The Son of God, David's son, was the one who built the temple originally. Cyrus, who had the temple rebuilt after the Babylonians destroyed it, was called by Isaiah the Lord's anointed. He's the only one we've got after the Davidic kings, who's actually called the Lord's anointed, which would be another term for the Messiah, right? And he's called that because he rebuilds the temple at his own expense, interestingly, right? Because the Persians thought the best way to have their empire preserved, and the Romans thought this too, is to have everyone worship their own gods and make sacrifices to their gods, including making sacrifices to the king of Persia. Right. And in fact, one of the reasons the temple falls later on, after Jesus dies, is they refuse to make sacrifices to the Roman emperor anymore, because they're really upset with Roman rule. But that's not, the Jesus movement has already started by then, so that's not really germane. But you can see this idea of a ruler establishing a temple would bring him great favor in the light of Israel's mind. So it's very puzzling why Jesus doesn't like the temple, but he really does. I mean, he predicts, whether he said tear this temple down as an imperative or there will not be one stone left on another, clearly he's predicting its downfall and calling it an idol. Yes, Anne, did you have, I'm sorry, I thought I saw you.
Twitchy, okay,
Just a twitch. All right. I had that happen too. Well, the transition, and what I find especially interesting, the transition that happens in the Gospel of Mark, as you know, is that once Jesus is in Jerusalem, things start to happen to him rather than him acting. So we call it a passion narrative. And I usually, I think of the word passion as, you live with a lot of passion, but it really means passive passion as in things passive, right? He's no longer acting, he's being acted on. And that all of the passion, if you will, starts in Gethsemane, which is why Gethsemane is really, to me, one of the most haunting narratives in Christianity. And it's worth looking at because the biblical authors know their history. This is really interesting. And we talked about this before. Glenn brought up when Isaac is made to carry the wood for the sacrifice that he is going to be. Is the gospel referring to that when they have Jesus carrying his own cross? And I would say absolutely, because can you imagine? The story of Isaac is known. It's repeated every day in Israelite worship. So it's extremely well known. Well, as we've seen, the death of Saul is also extremely well known because Saul is what you don't want to be as a king, right? And so you would use him as kind of like, I'm anti-Saul, right? So anything that happened to Saul is not going to happen to me. And it's fascinating because there are strong echoes of Saul in Gethsemane, very strong echoes, almost word for word echoes. So we'll just go through some of them. And I wish if I thought about it, I would have reprinted the Saul readings from last time. But they went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. And as you know, Peter and James and John are with him. He took with him Peter, James, and John, and began to be distressed and agitated. Right? So he's distressed and agitated. When Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid and his heart trembled greatly, right? So you're immediately aware that Jesus' experience now is starting to sound a lot more like Saul than it is like Solomon or like David, right? David was never afraid of anything. Solomon wasn't afraid of anything either, but Saul was. So Saul is known as the one who was terrified, right? And then he said to them, I am deeply grieved. So the narrator tells us he began to be distressed and agitated. Then Jesus tells us, I am deeply grieved even to death. Right? So he's grieved to death. You get the same thing in the night before Saul died. Samuel said to Saul, bring Samuel up, has a woman of Endor bring him up from Sheol. And Samuel says to him, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? Saul answered, I am in great distress. Right? So this is one of the people we've seen before in great distress, for the Philistines are warring against me. And of course, Jesus knows that the authorities in Jerusalem want to kill him. And God has turned away from me. So what's going on in Gethsemane? God has turned away from me and answers me no more, either by prophets or by dreams. So I have summoned you to tell me what I should do. Samuel said, why then do you ask me, since the Lord has turned from you and become your enemy? Moreover, the Lord will give Israel along with you into the hands of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me, for the Lord will hand the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines. Immediately, Saul fell full length on the ground. He fell full length on the ground, pardon me, filled with fear because of the words of Samuel, and there was no strength in him. And then the woman came to Saul when she saw that he was terrified, right? But what does he do when he's terrified? He falls full length on the ground. Going back to the Gospel of Mark, he said to them, I am deeply grieved even unto death. Remain here and keep awake. And going a little further, he threw himself on the ground, right? And prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me. So he's actually making a request, right? Take this away. That's what he wants. Nevertheless, not what I want, but what you want. But does he get an answer? 3 times he prays. He doesn't get an answer. So he prays, and there's no answer. If you're an Israelite, who does that sound like? David always got an answer. Solomon always got an answer. Sometimes not the answer he wanted, right? But Solomon always got an answer. David prays 3 times in Gethsemane in great distress, deeply grieved unto death, and there's no answer. And there is no answer. The rest of his life, there's no answer. I mean, it's astonishing. So is this the Son of God, or is this Saul revisited? I mean, the gospel writers make no bones about this. They're not like being mysterious about it, especially being deeply grieved, being agitated, being deeply troubled, and then throwing himself on the ground. I think there's only one other person who does that, and it's Saul, right? So it's a really shocking reversal. Has God become Jesus' enemy? Has he withdrawn his steadfast love from Jesus? Right? Well, the enemies are having all this power over him. They hand him over. The temple soldiers hand him over to the temple authorities, who then hand him over to Pilate, who hands him over to the soldiers, who hand him over to be crucified. So Jesus is just bouncing around like a beach ball, unable to do anything. And whenever you're handed over, that's a sign that God is against you. God hands you over to your enemies. And so it really does appear, I mean, and there really is no doubt about it in my mind, but at least in the Gospel of Mark and in the Gospel of Matthew, God is abandoning Jesus. He's handing him over. Why? Why is he handing him over? Why is he treating him like Saul? I thought the whole point of the Davidic monarchy was that it'll never happen again, that this would never happen again, that a king would be abandoned by God's love. Well, you can see in the Passion narrative, as we technically call it, the trial before Pilate, the whole issue revolves around this question: are you the king of the Jews? So they just call it out. Like, let's quit walking around the issue. Let's just say you're presenting yourself as the king of the Jews. You came into Jerusalem as the king of the Jews. The people said you're the king of the Jews. Are you the king of the Jews, right? And of course, he doesn't answer that directly. He just says, you say so. So he doesn't say yes and he doesn't say no. He simply says, you say so. Then the chief priests speak against him, etc. You know, he's mocked. He's arrayed in a royal robe and made fun of with a crown of thorns. But they say, hail, king of the Jews, right? Because it's hysterical. This is your king. This guy can't do anything. He's utterly powerless to do anything. He doesn't even answer Pilate when he makes charges against him. Pilate says, have you no answer? See how many charges they bring against you? But Jesus made no further reply. And Pilate was amazed. This is a really interesting moment in sort of Christian ethics, that Jesus is accused and remains silent.
Silence.
It's the silence, right? The silence in the face of accusation. To be wrongfully accused of he's being wrongfully accused is one of the most stressful experiences you can go through. Psychologists now say it even beats death and divorce, death of somebody else and divorce, to be wrongfully accused in that way. And for Jesus to remain silent is really quite amazing at that moment. So clearly the issue at the end of his life is this the king of the Jews, right? And that was the issue from the very beginning. You are my son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased. Well, when he's hung on the cross, as you know, the inscription is hung above him, the King of the Jews. And it's meant to be a terribly funny joke, right? This is your king. He's reigning on the cross, right? And with Jesus, they crucified 2 bandits, one on his right and one on his left. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice. And of course, whenever darkness comes over the whole land, that's always a bad sign too, because God's presence is light, usually morning, day. So darkness is midday is not a good sign. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is the Aramaic, and I probably butchered it, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? So his own experience at this point, some argue, well, no, he's quoting the whole psalm. I'm like, really? I mean, couldn't you pick a better verse than that? Well, actually, Luke did. See, this really bothered, I think, this really bothered Luke, and this really bothered John. And they take it out. And so Luke has Jesus quote another psalm, Father, into your hand I commit my spirit, and then the consequences, for you have redeemed me, my rock and my redeemer, right? So there, you could quote a different psalm. In Luke's gospel, he does quote a different psalm. In John's gospel, he just says, it is finished, right? It is completed. I've done what I came to do. So, and then he breathes his last and dies very peacefully on the cross. So Mark and Matthew have a very different portrait, and I do think it really bothered the early Christian community that they did, and we'll talk more about that as to why in a second, but I think that's really interesting that this cry, my God, why have you forsaken me, really makes sense out of everything he's experiencing from Gethsemane on. It really does seem that God abandoned him, God forsook him at his hour of greatest need, when he needed God the most. And this is, again, very similar to Saul. He's desperate to get a response from God. He goes to dreams, he goes to priests, he goes to Urim and Thummim, he goes to prophets. He brings Samuel up from the dead, and it's like game over, you know? So God has become your enemy, and it does seem a similar thing is happening here. And of course, this then raises the question as to why, but there's no doubt in my mind that that's what the portrait of Jesus is representing to us here, especially if you look at it in these Israelite categories. Yeah, Tim.
Martin Luther said in this passage, my God, why have you forsaken me? God forsaking God, unimaginable.
Yeah, God forsaking God, unimaginable. Well, or God forsaking the one that he promised, I will never take my steadfast love from him as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from me, or who I put away from before you. Yeah, no, there is especially after Hegel in 20th century theology, there's a very strong push. You see it in Hans Urs von Balthasar, you see it in Everhard Jungel, you see it even in Karl Barth in some ways, that God is against, at this point in the history of God is against God, right? Or God is abandoning God, if you will. I think that's subsequent to Trinitarian discussions and things like that. I'm not sure that's exactly what's going on in this passage, because they don't see Jesus as God at this point, I don't think, but they certainly see him as the Son of God. They certainly see him as the beloved of God, and they certainly see him expressing that he's been abandoned by God or forsaken by God. Yeah, Lorraine?
It does look like God has abandoned him. If he hasn't abandoned God, he's still talking to God.
Right. No, he didn't. Yeah, so the observation was that Jesus is not abandoning God. God seems to have abandoned him. But that, again, is like Saul. Saul did not abandon the Lord, right? He's constantly seeking what the Lord wants him to do. But so in that sense, it's very similar, right? Because Saul is desperate to get an answer from the Lord, and that's why he brings Samuel up from the dead. I think the same thing's happening here. Jesus prays to God 3 times, and the answer is he's crucified. Right, and no voice from heaven, right? No cloud descending, no reassurance, no nothing, and also just a very different way of dying than we would see in other examples. So that's the other thing that's going on here is there is an idea in the world at this point, especially the Greco-Roman world, of a noble death, and the archetype of the noble death is Socrates. Right, and everybody who's reading the gospel knows of this death. The Jews knew of this death because of the Hellenization of the whole Mediterranean world by Alexander the Great and subsequently. So everybody knows the story of how Socrates died. And this is not Socrates, which is really, that's another shocking thing as well. Yeah.
But he's the Son of Man.
Right.
Jesus was, a man and God too.
Mhm.
So God is dealing with a man
Yeah.
who's an earthly king.
No, that's right. No, and that's a surprise, right?
But the fact that Jesus does not always says, let's do what you want, Lord.
Mhm.
Dad.
Yeah,
Let's do what you
daddy,
want.
right, exactly.
Okay. God cannot, you can't, God might turn his head or something like that, but you can't, you are still the image of God.
Mhm.
And God's love is for him. God is complete in himself.
Mhm.
So that part of God, you do not dismiss ever.
No, I don't, and I don't. I mean,
As children,
right. As children of God, we never dismiss that. Right.
Dismiss that.
Right. No, I
don't think God can dismiss that from himself, because what he is complete in himself.
Mhm.
And that's a part of it.
Right. No, I think you're right. I think Jesus, for instance, he calls him my God twice. So going back to your point and Lorraine's point, he's calling God out. He's saying, you're my God. Why aren't you acting like you're my God? Right. So I think you're right. I mean, Jesus is showing extraordinary faith here. But he's also dying a very tormented death, and quite publicly tormented death, because he's crying out in a loud voice.
But
That's
you
like,
said that too. I think Mark was right.
oh, I think he was, because you can also tell whenever people try to clean it up, that was probably the original thing. So he's crying out in a loud voice, which is, that's a sign of great anguish when you cry out in a loud voice. And then they think he's calling for Elijah. They try to keep him alive until Elijah comes. And then he gives a loud cry and breathes his last. So he dies basically screaming, right? So he first cries out or screams that God has forsaken him, or asks why God has forsaken him, and then he screams and dies. So it's a very, very vivid and very disturbing death narrative. And I say that because they knew, as I mentioned, people in this time knew of a different way of dying. And that's Socrates. So Socrates, like Jesus, Kierkegaard loved this comparison because Socrates was kind of his proto-disciple before Jesus even came along. Socrates was wrongfully accused, right? Socrates did not defend himself before his accusers, right? But listen to what Socrates says before his accusers. O judges, be of good cheer about death. Right? This is in his apology. This is Socrates. And know of a certainty that no evil can happen to a good man, either in life or after death. He and his are not neglected by the gods, nor has my own approaching end happened by mere chance. So in other words, he thinks that the gods are behind it. But I clearly see that the time has arrived when it was better for me to die and be released from trouble. For which reason I also am not angry with my condemners or my accusers, and I wish them they have done me no harm. They have done me no harm, right? So Socrates is happy to die. He's not just surrendering to death. It's my time's come. It's time for me to die. No evil can happen to a good man either in life or after death. And this made a huge impression on the Jews, right? Before Jesus' time. So the ruler, this horrible Seleucid ruler, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, which means God manifest. Can you imagine? This is around 165 before the Common Era. Came into Jerusalem at one point and seeks to put an end to the Jewish religion. He burns the Torah, he defiles the temple, he has a big sacrifice in the temple to the statue of Zeus. I mean, it's about as defiling as you can get. He doesn't destroy the temple, but he makes it impossible to sacrifice in there. And then he tells people if they don't eat swine flesh, he tells the Jews if they don't eat swine flesh, he will fry them alive, right? And Eleazar, one of the scribes, says, I'll just get a reminder. Is in his 70s, and he's told he was very well respected by the Roman soldiers who were carrying out this edict. So you can see, this is the first time in human history that we know of, that people are being killed because of what they believed. So, and this is 160 years, some years before Jesus comes along. So it happened yesterday. It's like the Civil War here, right? And the way these Jews die under Antiochus Epiphanes is very clearly influenced by Socrates. Eleazar, one of the scribes in high position, a man now advanced in age and of noble presence, was being forced to open his mouth to eat swine's flesh. But he, welcoming death with honor, rather than life with pollution, went up to the rack of his own accord, spitting out the flesh, right? As all ought to do who have the courage to refuse things that it is not right to taste, even for the natural love of life. What they did was they said, we know you're not going to, the soldiers knew him and they respected him. And they said, we're not going to make you eat swine, but we don't want you to die. So we're going to give you chicken instead, seriously, and eat that in conformity to the edict, and it will spare your life. And Eleazar says earlier than this, if I do that, the young people will look to me and think that's okay to do. Right? Pretend to go along with an evil edict, pretend to violate the law of God, so it'll go well with you in this life. He said, what a horrible thing to do. No, I welcome this death, this noble death, out of obedience to the law that God gave us through Moses, rather than pretending to obey an evil edict that violates the law of God, even though it would have saved my life. So it's a very moving passage. There's an even more moving one in a second. Yeah, Daniel?
That's interesting because during the Holocaust, my understanding in European Jewry, there was no kosher law. It's like eat what you get your hands on. The idea you can violate God's rules and regulations to save life. Well, this is kind of the opposite, not wanting to preserve his life because it appeared he was violating the dietary kosher laws. Isn't that interesting? An interesting dichotomy there.
Yeah, I don't know about kashrut during the Holocaust, so I wouldn't be able to speak to that. But these stories were, I mean, that's jumping way ahead. But yeah, so just in terms of biblical interpretation of the commandments, the rabbis always remember, but the rabbis are subsequent to this, the rabbis always remember that the Lord said through Moses, I set before you life and death, therefore choose life. So the first commandment of all commandments, however you interpret the commandments, choose life, right? So that still is, in fact, in rule. And that would be in the Holocaust. If you're starving to death in the camps, don't try to keep kosher because they're just going to give you whatever. So eat, but in reverence to God, right? So yes, that would be an externus, right? But yeah, so it's always for the sake of life. But what's interesting is the way people are willing to die. And they're clearly taking their signals from Socrates, right? It is good to die a noble death. Be of good cheer about that, they say. The most vivid one is a mother and her 7 sons. And it's in 2 Maccabees 7. And the mother takes her children, because they're all going to die. They're all going to refuse to eat swine. And so they're going to be thrown into this big cauldron and fried alive after their tongues are cut out and also their scalp. I mean, it's just horrible. And the mother, of course, is preparing them for this. And look at what she says. So they won't obey the king. And so the Antiochus is described as being the one carrying out these executions. The king fell into a rage and gave orders to have pans and cauldrons heated. These were heated immediately, and he commanded that the tongue of their spokesman be cut out, and that they scalp him. He's the oldest of the sons, and that they scalp him and cut off his hands and feet, while the rest of the brothers and one another looked on. I'm sorry, the rest of the brothers and the mother looked on. Can you imagine? When he was utterly helpless, the king ordered them to take him to the fire, still breathing, without his hands, without his feet, without his tongue, and without his scalp, and fry him in the pan. I mean, it's just like the smoke from the pan spread widely. But the brothers and their mother encouraged one another to die nobly. So they're encouraging each other in light of this horror to die nobly, saying, the Lord God is watching over us and in truth has compassion on us, as Moses declared in his song that bore witness against the people to their faces when he said, and he will have compassion on his servants. Right? So, and then each son gives testimony this way, that they die in hope. They die knowing that God loves them. They die knowing also that Antiochus is going to get what's coming to him. So there is a bit of that. But I think that line of the mother is just incredibly beautiful. God will have compassion on his servants. And so they're willing to die nobly, knowing that God has compassion on them. So if that's the template you have the Socrates template, and then you have the martyrs template, the Jewish martyrs template, which are again 160 years before Jesus. The way Jesus' death is portrayed in Mark and in Matthew is really surprising and very different. It's not a noble death. It's a terrified death, right? And that's one of the questions. And of course, it's a deeply disturbing current all through Christian history right up to today is why? Why does this one who is the Son and the Beloved, why does he die this way? Starting in Gethsemane, why does he die in terror? And why does he die crying out that God has forsaken him? I mean, it really is. It's a we obviously know Easter is coming and all that, but it doesn't actually change the question. It doesn't change the question. Why was Jesus treated this way at the end of his life? And it was treated this way by God. You could say, oh yeah, it's those wicked people in Jerusalem and all that. But really, the major question is, why is God handing him over to be treated this way? And that is a very haunting question.